Hello again, and welcome to the 8th in our series of 28 programs on the Gospel of Mark. We're here with Father Mike Lastiri, the Director of Evangelization and Worship for the Diocese of Fresno, and also pastor of Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish in Hanford. And across from me, my good friend Dr. Robert Maldonado, who is here again, having been here many years on Breaking Open the Word, is here breaking open his favorite gospel, the Gospel of Mark. You know, where we left off last week was chapter 2 of Mark, verses 13 to 17. And we had this very interesting situation at the end of talking about Jesus' fellowship, and where maybe those that didn't come in because they were too righteous. And I wonder if, Robert, you can help us look at what would needed to have happened so that also they could have been brought in, and what other light do other scriptures shed on who's in, who's out?
Well, as I said last time, who is speaking to whom in the gospel is pretty important, and these opponents of Jesus are asking questions of the disciples. They're not asking directly of Jesus, so they're not interacting. And Jesus is at table fellowship with the tax collectors and sinners, and presumably these righteous opponents are not participating because they're not following the way Levi and the others are actually following. And the passage in John that I couldn't quite bring out at the end of the last episode is this one. It's after the healing of the man born blind in chapter 9. And Jesus talks about, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sin, but now that you say we see, your sin remains. And so there's this sense that the righteous are the ones that are sort of not doing what they're supposed to do, and not able to enter, sort of as a self-regulating. You know, they're not being excluded the way the tax collectors and the sinners are being excluded from access to God. They're presuming it, and so it's a reversal of that. And
a great connection to bring us to a different gospel, to have a different whole, a different audience, a different vocabulary. But very enlightening to see John in 9, which is something we in the catechumenate will spend years trying to find the depth of that gospel. Thank you for bringing that up, Robert. Now, back to Mark, and very interesting, we're in the third conflict story, which actually builds nicely on the one we just left, not only the one in Mark, but the conflict that we just heard Robert read in John. We're seeing this antipathy, this real struggle between different forces at play. I wonder if Father Mike could read us 2:18 to 22 to set up this very short but very powerful conflict.
Thank you, Jim. Let's begin. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guest fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts a new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost. And so are the skins, but new wine is made for new skins.
Well, we have a program in the diocese called New Wine, and it's definitely for those who are looking for an enriched experience of their own faith formation. So we want to say this is the passage that it's all rooted in. But there's a lot more going on than talking about adult faith formation in the Diocese of Fresno. Would either one of you want to make the first cracking open what is the conflict here? Why is it important? Why does Mark put it at this point in the Scripture? Why do we still read it now? Any part of that would any of you want to crack open?
Well, the conflict, I think, first of all, is the whole system of fasting. One group is, one group isn't. Why are they choosing? One just chooses not to, the other. What is the tradition out of fasting? Who are the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees in comparison to Jesus' own community that he has begun to form? Why are they doing something that's different than to the mainstay? I think all of those kind of conflicts come into play, and it also shows that not everything was, if you will, copacetic, for lack of a better term, with everyone in the picture.
Absolutely. Robert, what more do you want to uncover here?
Well, I think the emphasis, obviously, by using the wedding imagery and the bridegroom imagery, which again, interestingly, connects back to John, as John likes to use that imagery as well. And so immediately, Jesus is with them, and so fasting seems to be inappropriate. And it does say that there will be some time after the bridegroom is taken away that they might fast again. And so, again, I see this connecting to the previous story where you have the tax collectors and sinners at table fellowship with Jesus. They are being included in the new project of God with Jesus. And so that is a celebration, and it would be good news for them. Remember, the gospel is good news, and so a cause for celebration. And this is continuing that, so that it would be inappropriate. Because the tax collectors and sinners' lives have been sort of forced fasts. They've been miserable, and now they're being included in the new kingdom.
One thing that Father Mike alluded to is the idea of, well, let's figure out who these parties are. And one group that is kind of like needing to be cracked open for me, John's disciples. I wonder if either one of you want to give us their names, or also broaden the question to how did the early Christian community, the followers of Jesus, distinguish themselves from the followers of John, that there was actually, as Father Mike said, not everything copacetic, not everything in perfect harmony. There was obviously a different spirituality maybe among all these variant groups. Do you want to address the disciples of John?
Well, many of your viewers might not know that there were disciples of John that continued to hail John as the Messiah, and that this group actually lasted into the Middle Ages as a distinct group, and that the followers of John were in some competition with the followers of Jesus. So Christians and John the Baptist followers were ongoing struggle as to who was the proper person to follow. And some of the treatment of John the Baptist in the Gospel is a little bit of a remnant of that, or an echo of that conflict.
The other group that we should unpack, and I think all three of us might want to have a chance at saying something about these people. They come up often. They are usually maligned. They're usually given a stereotypical presentation that to this day, Judaism is correct to call us on. Pharisees need, as they say, their due credit. So, Father Mike, do you want to start us off on something about the Pharisees? And then I know Robert can add something, and then if there's something still to be said, these are one of my favorite topics because I find they need to be clarified for a Catholic audience. They really do. Father Mike.
Well, Pharisees were, within Judaism at the time, certainly like Christianity today, there were different sects, there were different opinions, there were different ways of looking at how God was relating to his people. All of those variations, because you also had the Sadducees, you had other groups too, and the Pharisees happened to be one of those groups. And like all things, when you don't know, you tend to clump everybody in the same boat. And not even that the Pharisees were bad. It has nothing to do with that. What Jesus was dealing with was the extremes of that particular, but not as a group, but for the extremes of, as any religion may have its extremists or those who want to, as we even in the Catholic tradition say, those who are holier than the Pope. It's really about some of those things that Jesus was challenging, especially where it came to how people were treated, what was expected of them. We know that both in the Gospels how we hear about laying heavy loads on people. But the Pharisees happened to be one of the sects within Judaism. And one of the great positive of the Pharisaical sect was that they were one of the early people to kind of advance the idea of resurrection. And so that'll become later. But so sometimes when we clump or give a negative name, it's really terribly unfair. It's unfair to Judaism, and it's certainly unfair to the Pharisees.
Robert.
And they worked with the poor, too. Yeah. And we also actually now think that there were less of them in the time of Jesus. One of the things that's happening as the Gospels are being written toward the end of the first century is that Christianity and Judaism, which had been much more part of Second Temple Judaism together, after the temple is destroyed and diaspora life is really both Christian and Jewish only, Christianity and Judaism begin to define themselves over and against each other. And so the portrait of the Pharisees in the Gospels is often a portrait of the conflict that's going on that was not a conflict actually in the time of Jesus. Jesus actually has way more in common theologically with the Pharisees than almost any other sect in Judaism at the time. And it's a little bit like, you need to take some of the portraits of the Pharisees with a healthy grain of salt. It's a little bit like, the Democrats' versions of the Republicans and the Republicans' versions of the Democrats, especially in a presidential campaign or something, because those are the times where, you're using the opponent, and it's the contemporary opponent, as a foil for promoting some platform or responding to some circumstance, and that's what the early Christians are doing as well.
I think that idea of bringing up Democrats and Republicans, and this is different. Republicans is not publicans. We talked about the publicans last time. This is Republicans. We know who they are. To say that the verbiage that might be said in party, out of party, partisan politics, it may be shedding some real good light on what might have been the way people speak about a group when they are either in that group and they can get by with doing that, or they're enemies of the group, so they're going to have a skewed presentation. That's for openers. Final thought before our break. I heard a talk probably 40 years ago, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum gave a talk on the 10th anniversary of the document Nostra Aetate, which is the document on the Catholic understanding of non-Christian religions, especially Judaism. That's the main chapter in that wonderful document, is on Judaism. And he said, you guys did a great job. He was speaking to seminarians, actually. You guys did a great job. Except there's one thing that when you preach, please learn better how to preach about our Pharisees. Because believe it or not, Judaism today is the fruit of the survival of the Pharisees. Were there no Pharisees, there would be no Judaism anymore. This is the strain, this is our tradition, it's what we survived because of. So please preach adequately, learn the reality of Judaism at the time of Jesus, and understand better your presentation of the sect that is Pharisaic. And thank you very much, Rabbi Tannenbaum. On that note, we'll take a break. We'll be back in 1 minute. Don't go anywhere. We have a lot more for you. Hello again, and welcome back to the Gospel of Mark. I really can't believe we're on our 8th episode. We're finishing it off. We're completing right now with you chapter 2 of Mark's Gospel. Father Mike Lastiri, Dr. Robert Maldonado. I wonder if we could pick up right where we left off, and that would be with Robert reading the verses 223 to 228 to complete chapter 2 of the Gospel of Mark.
One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
This is the fourth of the 5 conflict stories that I promised would be coming one upon the other. We've dealt as best we could with the first 3. All of a sudden, we have another setting, a different geographic venue, and Robert is the one hoping to spend some time saying, there's really a lot going on in these few verses. Robert, what do you want to share?
Well, this is a very important episode. It's introducing the disciples. I've mentioned that the disciples become a kind of negative example, but here they're actually doing well. So they start well.
Because they break the law.
Yeah, because they break the law. But actually, no. It says they're walking along alongside a grain field, and the verb "walking alongside" there probably implies a path that's already there. But that what Mark says is the disciples begin to make a way into the grain fields, and so it's like they go off the already established road or path, and
wow.
They're making a way. And of course, remember, way is the preeminent Markan symbol for Christian discipleship. So the disciples are making a new way into the grain field. And then, of course, this establishes the controversy that's going to happen. They start plucking grain and taking the chaff off, which is work, which is not supposed to be done. And at this point, the Pharisees sort of pop up in the grain field. I get this image of like a Broadway musical, and all of a sudden they're there singing a song or something, and object. And Jesus then cites this passage from the Hebrew Bible. And interestingly, and kind of famously, sort of misquotes it. Abiathar was not the high priest, if you go to the Hebrew Bible and read this story. But even then, I'm not sure about this as a mistake, because this could be another place where he was the son. And so this could be a place where it's actually not Abiathar the high priest. It could be Abiathar of the high priest. So it could be another of these instances in Mark where he's leaving the son out, because presumably Abiathar, as God's high priest, is a good guy. And what's interesting about this story is that the story doesn't obviously directly relate as a response. The Pharisees have objected, and Jesus tells this story about David eating this bread, which was not a Sabbath controversy, but he did break a law too. He wasn't supposed to eat this bread. And the important thing is that Jesus seems to be telling this story as a response to the Pharisees, which then suggests that somehow his disciples are like David. And of course, what was relevant about David was that he was the sovereign, right? And so he could break the law simply because of the kind of power he had.
If the president does it, it's okay.
Perhaps, yeah. And so in that sense, then, Jesus is approving his disciples because they're making the way, they're actually following, and he's comparing, they have privileges in his new social institutional space that are not unlike sovereigns. And of course, this is actually going to set up their downfall, because I think what really happens to the disciples as characters is that they really run with that. We're like kings, and so they then want power, they want privilege, they want to be treated differently, and almost every mistake that the disciples are going to make after this point is their confusion that Jesus' approval translates into their own privilege.
Interesting. You know, what I've become just marveling at the more I prepare for these programs is how quickly important concepts, important realities in the Markan spirituality are right on the table right away. So these conflicts, which seem a little bit delayed in some of the other narratives, are just out there from the get-go. There's like no hostages here. It's right away you've got something going on. Father Mike, one thing that's going on in the second word in our scripture on this passage, one Sabbath. Could you open up for us a little bit, for our viewers, the concept of the Sabbath, just why it's important for the Jews of that time, for the Jews today, any way you'd like. Introduce us to the Shabbat. What is it?
Well, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, is, of course, the day God rested, if you will, in the book of Genesis, the seventh day. And there are certain of our contemporary religious traditions that keep that. It was the day holy to God. And therefore, when it became holy to God, the rest of God, if you will, and then it was to consider that then all should rest on that day. It became a very important day because from, if you will, the setting of the sun the night before, which we would say Friday, until Saturday, the Sabbath, people were to rest. They were not to do manual labor. There were a lot of do's and don'ts, more don'ts than do's that were allowed. People would prepare meals ahead of time. Anything related to farming, whatever, would have been done beforehand so that you were as free from doing anything unnecessary as humanly possible in this period of time. And because that was held so strongly, and again, talking as we talked earlier about the certain sects within the Judaism, certain groups would hold it even more important, and therefore that it had to be observed more strictly. But it's a day that everyone rested from their labors. And we in our own Christian tradition used to have that. Sunday was our day of rest before the modern age, before Walmarts and malls were open on Sunday from morning to evening. Then people did close. We did seriously take that day to rest and keep from unnecessary labor. But unfortunately, this world has changed some. But we did follow that tradition as well.
Robert, is there anything special that Mark does with this idea of having a Sabbath story at this point? I mean, is there anything about that, adding to what Father Mike just shared, anything else that you'd think is kind of one more detail about the Sabbath?
Well, I think it's important also to follow up on what we were saying earlier, and that's that often the sort of it's a caricature of how the Jews of the time, the opponents of Jesus or of the Christians later, actually did things. So, there were allowances for exceptions for different kinds of things, and this one probably wouldn't have been one. This was this was kind of minor in a sense, or not like it was like no one's life was in danger or anything at this point, and so it could easily have been delayed, but Mark's community seems to think, and this may be again connected to the sort of tax collectors and sinners being included, the hungry, the poor, and so when you're satisfied, when you have a little extra padding, being hungry for a little bit is not such a bad thing. But if it's a daily existence to be hungry, and then in God's community there is satisfaction, then why wouldn't you then satisfy your needs? And so Mark's Jesus here seems to be, again in the comparison to David, is saying, my followers, like sovereigns, have the right and ability to satisfy basic needs, including hunger. It's also interesting on the Sabbath, too. Certainly the God resting is a really important one. But in Deuteronomy, the reason that's given for keeping Sabbath is because you were slaves in Egypt, and I rescued you. And so I think that kind of liberation, incorporation into the new family of God is sort of an echo in the Sabbath controversies as well.
Last week we really tried to, give a good press to the Pharisees, just resurrect them as valuable people that need to be reassessed. Sabbath observance, a few details, and then we'll call it a day. We say, why did they invent all these laws, 613? Give them credit. They had the 10 to begin with, and then the whole effort of the rabbis was to create fences around so that, in a sense, to keep the 10, you've got the others. And it was like, that seems nitpicking. Maybe, maybe not. Give them credit for an effort of trying to live in a pagan environment to protect their own identity as Jews. So in a certain way, Sabbath observance became, in that world, a very progressive movement forward, because instead of being in that drudgery of 24/7, you're only 24/6, because you've got that one day of grace. And that's one thing that we should remember when we see Sabbath. It was a beautiful thing. In Judaism, they still speak of it as the queen. When you begin on Friday evening with the sundown, you have 24 hours of grace. No work. Everything is grace. It's a gift from God. Robert, Michael, 30 seconds if there's a final thought to wrap up anything that is on your lips, wishing to be said. Any final thought before we close?
Well, I just like to go back to that very last line. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. But the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That it is our service. That everything God has given us is at the service of humanity, not vice versa. And I think sometimes when we become nitpicky with things, we need to be reminded of that.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Michael, and that would be Father Michael, I shouldn't, just because he's my friend, Father Michael Lastiri, and Dr. Robert Maldonado for being here these many weeks to help us create for you a program not only of random thoughts about the Gospels, but line by line, a look at the first Gospel, the first catechism of the Christian community, the first Vade Mecum. Hopefully these are enriching you as they're enriching us. God bless.